Baking your own bread has become quite popular these days, and that makes perfect sense because if you stay home, you cannot catch the virus and you cannot spread the virus. So whether you're a beginner in bread baking or a veteran, it doesn't matter. You should be able to follow this recipe. And I want to go an extra step today. I'm not using my KitchenAid because I'm very well aware that some people don't have this kind of equipment, and I will show you how to make your bread with your own hands, start to not really finish because I still have to use the oven, but until it goes into the oven. For the wheat bread that I'm baking today, you will need 500 grams of flour, and I'm using an all-purpose flour here. You could as well use some bread flour or spelt flour. Any kind of light flour will work. Also, I'm using 250 milliliters of lukewarm water. I'm using 10 grams of salt. You can reduce the salt to 8 grams if you want. Then I'm having here 10 grams of sugar. The original recipe was asking for 40 grams of sugar, and that's way too much for my taste. But if you want to have a sweet bread, you could of course use 40 grams of sugar. I'm using 10 grams. Then I need 11 grams of yeast, and I know that in some areas yeast is very hard to get at these days, so I've made a video about how to make your own yeast. It's a yeast water, and the video is here. You could use this yeast water, here it is, and substitute it for 200 milliliters of this water. Instead you use 200 milliliters of the yeast water and then just add 50 milliliters of the lukewarm water. So that's how it works instead of the yeast. But I still have yeast, so I'm using it. And you also need 40 grams of soft butter. I will start with putting the flour into a larger bowl. And if you don't have a large bowl, you could also use a large pot. It will also work putting it on a board like this one here and work through it with your hands. It's a little more difficult, but it works too. So I make a little bit of an indentation here, and I am adding some of the lukewarm water. And I'm adding, let me see, yeah, that's the sugar. I'm adding the sugar and also the yeast. I'm mixing this a little bit here with some of the flour, just a bit, like this, and then I let it stand for a couple of minutes to activate the yeast. It's not really necessary to do that, but sometimes if you have a yeast that is in your pantry or fridge for a longer time, it might not work that well anymore, and this way you can be sure that your yeast is still okay. If not, you can still switch it out. If you mix this immediately with the entire flour and then later turns out that the yeast is not working because the dough is not rising, that would be way more difficult to fix that problem. So that's why I very often first make sure that my yeast is still okay. It's only been a couple of minutes and you can already see that this is rising and bubbling very nicely, which tells me that my yeast is very active and very well on the way to work for me. So now I will add the salt, and I put it to the rim because salt and yeast are not best friends except if you use a certain technique, but I'm not going into that thing right now. What I want to do is I also want to add the butter. And your butter should really be soft, otherwise it's difficult to knead it into the dough. Oh. All right. Okay, and the remaining water. I'll leave a little bit of the water in my jar here, just to make sure that my dough has the right consistency and I don't have to add any flour, which would kind of change the proportions of my recipe. So I always, leave some water at first, and when I see that I need more water, I can still add it. Okay, so of course I have washed my hands, who doesn't these days? And I just start to roughly mix this a little bit. and I knead it with my fingers. And it's very interesting if you make bread with your own hands instead of with a machine, because you can really feel how the dough is changing while you are kneading it and while you're working on it. And this gives you a way better experience, or how can I say that, way better feeling about how your dough is supposed to be when it's finished. So even if you have a KitchenAid at home, I really challenge you to take the time and really knead it by hand, just to get a feeling for your dough. And you can see it's coming together already quite nicely. There's still a little bit of dry ingredients here. I will add a tiny little drop of water just to catch that part. But other than that, I have a feeling that I have enough of the water in my dough. And I'm switching to kneading on my board. If you don't have a board, don't worry, you can use your kitchen table or other table or your kitchen countertop, whatever you have where you're working on. And now I'm starting to knead this with my hands, and this will take a while, like I would say at least 10 minutes. I will have to feel how my dough is feeling, and I will go to the next scene from here when I feel that my dough is changing, and I try to explain to you how my dough is feeling right now. So I will continue to knead, and you'll see me in the next scene. Yeah, I've been kneading now for about 4 minutes, and I can already notice some changes in the dough. So at the beginning it was like feeling a little bit like crumbly in the dough. It has become a lot softer. I still feel some kind of lumps in there, but a lot less than at the beginning. And the dough becomes a lot softer overall. I'm standing here in some kind of lounge position, and when I knead, I put my hand in the dough and I use my body weight to press the dough down like this. So this is the easiest way to do it. And I want to show you now, if I use this dough and I stretch it like this, you can see that it's still ripping apart, which shows me that my dough is not finished. So later I will show you how it's supposed to look, so that you can see if I put some tension on the dough, it is still ripping here and becomes very uneven. So I have to continue to knead as expected, and I will show you when the dough has changed again. Now it's been 8 minutes since I started kneading. Let's check out of the dough again. So I put some tension in here, and it looks a lot better than last time I did, but I still see here some ripping parts on the sides. It's not completely smooth yet. You can also see some dents here and some hives kind of. So I'll continue to knead for another 2 minutes. This dough now started to feel like Play-Doh. It's very soft, very nice to touch. I really like that feeling. And you see that this is very smooth. All the hives are gone. And yeah, let's see if we can put some tension into the dough. It's still ripping here a little bit, but not because of the dough. It's because of how I kneaded it and put it together. But let me continue to just put some tension in here, and you see this is very smooth and very nice, and this is the way I want it. Now I'll put this back into this bowl where I started, and I'm adding a lid. You can also add a wet towel, kitchen towel, and now it has to rise for about 50 to 60 minutes, depending a little bit on the temperature in your house. It should be at a warm place. I have an oven that has a proof function, so I'll put it into that oven to let it proof, and sometimes in summer when it's very warm, I just put it outside my patio here in Texas, which works perfectly too. So after an hour, your dough should look somewhat like this. And you can see this has definitely increased in size a lot. And I will now take this out of the bowl. And I will now fold the dough. That means that I shape it in a somewhat rectangular or square shape. And I fold it from the top to the center. I turn it from the top to the center, and so on. And I repeat this for 4 rounds, so overall 16 times. Yeah, and this creates some tension in the dough, and I can even increase it by pulling it on this board a little bit. And the seams, I try to close them as good as possible, like this. So now I could put this into a baking pan, like a loaf pan. That would be one possibility. Another option would be to bake this bread in a Dutch oven. I have done that. I've ruined one of my Dutch ovens with that. So now I have 2, one for baking bread and one for regular cooking. But my favorite way to bake a bread is just to put it on a baking sheet and just bake it the way it is without any shape giving or enclosed environment. This way, in my opinion, the crust turns out just perfect for me. I like it very crisp. And if you like it that way too, maybe you do the same thing, but it's okay if you want to rather put it into a baking pan. So my bread will go onto a baking sheet right now, and I want it to be a little lengthwise. You can make a round bread, whatever shape you prefer. So for me, I like it when the loaf is in a oval shape, in a loaf shape, and this way I can cut it a little easier with my cutting machine. Let me show you this thing here. So that's perfect for bread. Okay. Now this has to rest again for another hour, but you will be surprised how large this loaf is gonna be within this hour. 1 hour later, it looks like this, and I think this looks fantastic. It's very light and fluffy. I've preheated the oven like 20 minutes ago to 390 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 200 degrees Celsius. Now, before I put this into the oven, I want to score it a little bit, which means that I'm going to cut into this loaf. And you can use a very sharp knife for this, or a razor blade like this. This is a lame, which is especially made for bread scoring. And when you score, you cut it lengthwise, ideally, so that the bread can expand in the oven. Also, you don't cut it straight. You have a little bit of an angle when you do that, okay? So this is the one thing that I'm doing right before I put it into the oven. I personally have found out that it's easier to score bread if you put a little bit of flour on top of the bread, and that's what I'm going to do now. Okay, let's see. And you cut about 1/4 of an inch deep And I could just leave it like this. Let me go a little deeper here. If you want to have it a little more decorative, you can make a few more cuts like this. Something like that. Okay, you can also go around like this. I think that's enough. I'll put it now into the oven, and I will spray the oven walls with some water. If you don't have a sprayer, you can also just put some a little jar of water into the oven, so that creates some humidity in the oven, and this the steam that's in there will make the crust of your bread very nice and very, very crusty. So, and after 10 minutes in the oven, I will open the oven door for a little bit so that the steam can get out of the oven, and then I continue to bake it. And the overall baking time depends, of course, a little bit on the size and the shape of your bread. With my bread, it usually takes about 30 to 35 minutes. So while my bread is in the oven, I would like to take a moment to explain the different techniques of making bread. Today I showed you how to make a bread with yeast. Yeast is a fungus, and it is one way to make a bread rise. Another way to do it is with sourdough. So a sourdough starter is not a fungus. It contains a little bit of yeast though, but it is basically made from bacteria. And it's a different kind of rising your bread. It's mostly used for rye bread, but you can use it with any bread dough. The difference between making a bread with yeast or making it with sourdough is that with yeast you let it rise twice for an hour and then you can bake it. While with sourdough you first need a sourdough starter. You do this, you make that once, and then you can use it and reuse it again and again. But you need that first, and then you make a sourdough with the starter, and the sourdough has to ferment for about 18 minutes, depending on the recipe. And then you use this sourdough for your bread dough, where you add another amount of water and flour and these things. So it takes a lot longer than making a yeast bread. The reason why many people prefer to make a sourdough bread is, for example, that the sourdough bread stays fresh longer than a yeast bread. A yeast bread will be perfectly and wonderful the first day, maybe even the second day. But after then, it starts to taste a little stale and dry, and it's not as delicious as it was at the beginning. Other than that, it is faster, but the sourdough bread will increase in its taste for the next days after it was baked, and it will be fresh much longer. So a sourdough bread usually is good for almost a week to use. Then there are the no-knead breads, and these no-knead breads, as the name suggests, you don't knead your bread, you let this process happen chemically in the bread, but that takes time. So instead of kneading it for 10 minutes, you put this aside for 18 to 24 hours, and then the process that happens during the kneading happens all by itself, just in the dough, without any kneading. So yeah, your hands stay clean, and that's probably an upside. I personally don't see the point in that because it takes so long. I sometimes just want to have my bread right now. So, but yeah, it depends on your personal preference what you want to do. Then there are also breads that are made with baking powder or with soda and buttermilk. I don't have a recipe for that right now, but the Irish soda bread is an example for that. Very delicious. Yeah, so these are the different techniques to make a bread, and you find a sourdough bread on my blog, actually more than one. Also, if you want to start your own sourdough starter, which is super easy, you will find how to do that in this video, and there's also a blog post about that with even more information about it. I hope that helps you a little bit, and I will have to wait another 15 minutes until my bread is hopefully ready, and then I will show it to you. The bread was now in the oven for 35 minutes, and I got it out of the oven. And you might wonder, how do I know if my bread is ready to be getting out of the oven? And it's a very easy trick. You just turn it around and you knock on it, and if it sounds hollow, that tells you that your bread is ready to be taken out of the oven. So this is what it looks like now. And that turned out very nice. It's super hot. You see that the scoring has decorated and opened here a little. It looks beautiful. I will let this bread now cool completely, and then I will cut it open. And this is another tip for you. If you bake a bread, I know it's very tempting to eat it while it's still warm, but always let it cool completely, because this keeps the moisture in the bread. You don't want to have a dry bread after like an hour. So wait until it's really completely cooled, and then you cut it open. The bread has cooled now, and I will give it a cut. I will use my knife for this, and then for the additional slices I will use my cutting machine. So let's see what it looks like from the inside. Yeah, this has a very, very nice texture, very small, which I like, and it smells fantastic. It's a very soft bread. Let me bring this in here and cut just one slice for you. So yes, so there you have it. It's a very nice bread. Now I hope you like this video, and I hope you try this. If you just followed my steps and baked your first bread ever, congratulations, you just achieved a new life skill. And for everyone else who is a veteran bread baker, I hope you like this as much as I do. It's one of my favorite breads also in the entire family. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now, and also hit this little bell button so you get a notification every time I upload a new video. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned. There will be a next video just after the pictures.